Once again, welcome to those who are beginning to join us for tonight's broadcast. Looking forward to our presenter tonight, Steve Gabriel. We will be starting in 3 minutes. And again, if you have any friends that you think could benefit from this information, feel free to reach out to them. You have a few minutes left, and we should be starting in about 3 minutes. Thank you again for joining us. Good evening, and thank you for joining us once again, and welcome to our monthly series, Inspiring Ideas from Experts in the Field. The webinar is in our third year for NOFAMAS, and it is our hope that we can make quality farm and gardening management education easily accessible to everyone, anytime, everywhere. My name is Anna Gilbert Muhammad, and I am the Food Access and Webinar Coordinator for NOFAMAS. My email is anna@nofamas.org. Feel free to contact me with feedback about this webinar, our webinar series in general, or with any food access, food justice, or our Teen Summit questions. Before we start tonight's broadcast, I would just like to take some time to thank our sponsors this evening, the Green Leaf Foundation, making small grants to nonprofits that promote organic farming, gardening, and community development in the New England area, to Wells Croft Fence Systems. If you can farm it, we can fence it. To Certified Humane, considered the gold standard in animal welfare certification and labeling programs. And last but not least, the Chelsea Green Publishing Corporation, the politics and practice of sustainable living. And I just wanted to add the last three presenters, Ben Falk in June, Sarah Flack last month, and Steve Gabriel tonight, have all come from Chelsea Green. They have publications at Chelsea Green. So please go to Chelsea Green and check out the books that these folks have written. They are very in depth. What they're sharing with us tonight on our broadcast for the last couple of months. It's just really a snippet of what they've written, and you just want to take that time to get their books and take a deeper dive. I'd also like to take this time to thank all the NOFAMAS staff and board who have made this particular webinar possible, and for the use of our new webinar portal that we've been using for the last few months. And if you want to reach out and just send me a note in terms of what you think of the portal, how you like it, that'd be great. And lastly, on this point, if you are not a member of NOFAMAS, I would love it if you would consider joining us to support our education and policy work. You can visit our website at nofamass.org to learn more about the work that NoFaMass is doing in the state of Massachusetts as it relates to organic farming, organic food, organic certification, soil technical assistance, food justice, and the like. So without further delay, I'd like to introduce our presenter this evening. Steve Gabriel will be joining us. He is the Extension Specialist at Cornell Small Farms Program. And just to let you know, tonight's format will be a presentation with the ability to have intermittent questions and answers throughout the presentation. So what I'd like everyone to do in this portal, we have the ability to, you have the ability to click on the questions option, type in a question. I will get that to Steve, and in different intervals, he will answer those questions. If you are calling in tonight, joining us by phone, you can reach me directly at 413. You can text me at 413 214 1237. Again, you can text me at 413 214 1237. And as you're logging in, we would love to know where you're coming from tonight. If you have people watching it with you, if you're a rancher, farmer, just want to learn more about livestock like me, in that question, tab, please type in your name, the farm that you're from, and possibly if you have more than one person viewing this with you. So without any further delay, I'd like to make sure that Steve has unmuted himself at the time. Steve, you can go ahead and unmute yourself, and I will give you the ability to start presenting.
All right, good evening.
All right, good evening. It's good to have you. And you can go ahead and bring your presentation up at any time. All right, Steve, you have the floor.
All right, well, thanks so much, and thanks, folks, for joining us this evening. And if you're watching the recording later on, then later on. My name's Steve Gabriel, and I wear a couple hats in my work. I'll talk about that a little bit as we get into the presentation. But tonight I wanted to share with you all some thoughts and some experience I've had around thinking about animals in our farm landscapes. This journey through, I've pretty much raised every type of animal possible, kind of worked through the list, and settled on some that work well in the context where I'm coming from. And my wife and I run Wellspring Forest Farm here in central New York. And we'll talk a bit about that, but also give you some examples of other farms that are doing really innovative work out there in the field. I want to start and sort of presence where I'm coming from and broadcasting from tonight. We're coming from the traditional lands of the Haudenosaunee, specifically the Cayuga Nation. So this is the confederacy that's often known as the Iroquois. It's 6 nations, and that encompasses much of New York State, but also up into parts of Ontario and Canada. It's important for us, my wife and I, as farmers and as educators, to recognize and deliberate and sit with the fact that we're farming on land that's been stolen from Indigenous people, and that these Indigenous people are not figment of the past, as it's often talked about in literature and as we learn, but it's actually a present. So these people are alive and well and thriving and scattered throughout New York State, but also throughout other parts of Canada and the US. And so just bring that to the forefront of our conversation tonight. And I think it's important for all of us to understand what the Indigenous people are named and learn about them more wherever we're farming, wherever we're growing. And I encourage you to check out the link at the bottom of the slide here, which gives us a map where we can look at and understand a little bit more about that. So our farm is really on the edge. We're actually on the edge of, if you look at this map here, there's 2 really long skinny lakes. There's Cayuga Lake and there's Seneca Lake. And our farm is really quite perched right in between. Our watershed, we're at the top of a watershed, that green watershed there that drains down into the Cayuga Lake, named after the Cayuga Nation. And just a few miles away from us, we'd be draining into the Seneca Lake Basin. And that watershed divide is really what divides the traditional territories of those 2 nations. If you go south into that kind of turquoise or darker blue or darker green area, that's actually the continental divide. So the land starts to drain south to the Chesapeake. So our farm is really perched sort of on the edge of multiple spaces, whether we look at sort of traditional land use, whether we look at the watershed divides. And for us, it's really important to ground and understand our farming practices in these larger systems and these larger patterns. I'll talk a bit about our farm, but I want to mention too that I work for the Cornell Small Farms Program. This is a statewide extension program, although we do work across the country. My specific area of focus within Cornell Small Farms is in specialty mushroom production, which we won't talk about tonight. But if you're interested in that, I just wanted to mention that. It's something I'm very passionate about, and we're starting to do work both in rural and urban areas around mushroom production as a really viable niche crop. And if you're interested in that, you can check out cornellmushrooms.org. That really points you to a lot of the resources. So in addition to that, I spend half my time stewarding this landscape, about 20 acres that we have title to, and another 30 or so that we lease from neighbors to have our farm. And what we do on our farm is we produce mushrooms, both indoors and out in the woods. We produce maple syrup, and we've sold sap in the past as well. We have duck eggs, we have pastured grass-fed lamb, we do elderberry extract, and arguably one of our main crops is also education as we go. So here we are sharing a bit of our experience, and the books I've authored and co-authored are part of that mission to really share what we've learned and what the collective knowledge is out there with the greater community. So you can check out more about our website. Education-wise, we do a lot of different things. We have open weekends. We do some short educational events. We have an online course menu, which I'll talk about at the end of this. And we invite people out to the farm. So we have a yurt that we rent as an Airbnb. So people can interact and experience the farm in a lot of different ways. And that's been important for us to build sort of a ecosystem of different enterprises and different opportunities in order to create a sustainable farm for ourselves.
Steve, very quickly, could you advance your slides?
I'm sorry?
Could you advance your slides?
Yes. Are you not seeing them advance?
No, we're just looking at your title page.
I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Let me figure out why that's not showing, because I'm advancing them on my screen.
Ah, there we are.
I guess maybe I'll have to show you this version. Does that show different?
It does. It does. If you wanted to just go back through, I know you mentioned the map and
yeah. I'm sorry that didn't work. I don't know. Are you seeing the change now?
I did see the change. So you should be good. You may have to manually advance it.
Okay.
There it is. Mm-hmm.
All right, I guess we'll have to do it this way. Does that work?
That works. I think you're good now.
Sorry about that. Here's our map.
No worries.
No worries. Yeah, no, I didn't realize that's weird. Here's our farm in the bigger picture, and a little bit about the Small Farms Program. Talked about our farm and our products that we produce, and some of the education that we do on the farm is one of our main enterprises. Picture of our yurt that we rent. And here we are, arrived where I want it to be. So we'll just keep advancing through this way. It seems like it'll be good. I think when it comes to animals and on our farm landscape, we've kind of went down the list, but I've been farming for about 15 years, and part of that experience has been being able to work with different animals and understand some of their nuances and some of the ways they fit into an ecosystem. But my background and personal experience is based in ecology, specifically forest ecology. So I think a lot about, even if these are domesticated animals, where do they come from and what are their habitats? In the same way that we might do that if we were working with domesticated animals. They're no different. And I think they actually deserve and are, it's important to think of them in this context, that they are living sentient beings, that they have a place in the landscape, and that we can interact with them in a really positive way. And I think there's considerations on the species that we choose to put in the landscape, the breeds within those species that we work with, and then also the individualized care, meaning how are these animals treated in the past life before they essentially came onto the farm. So who is taking care of them? What does that look like? What are they used to? What are they familiar with? What have mothers of animals taught to their kin and so forth? So if I was to summarize, I think, my experience and my learning around what I would prioritize in terms of thinking about animals on the farm landscape, I think it's really important to first think about the species of animal and match it to the type of landscape that we have and the stage of succession it's in. And it's really important to understand that land has gone through an incredible transformation. In many cases, has been degraded in that transformation. And so animals can actually be a really important tool to restore and respond to that degradation by building up ecological health. We're going to talk a little bit about behavior-based management, which I think is a really phenomenal thing to dive into deeper that we won't have time to get into fully tonight. But some work from Fred Provenza and folks at Utah State University really elevates these ideas and harkens back to what I was just saying, which is the idea that animals, domesticated animals, have instincts, have knowledge, and have wisdom in the landscape that we can understand as we think about how we're going to raise them. It's really important, number 3 there, is that animals are always on rotation. There's really no exception to this. The animals have to be moving from one place to another. If they're left in confinement in one place for too long, that's when we see issues arise with overgrazing, with land degradation, with erosion, and with toxicity in animals. We're going to touch briefly on the difference between ruminant animals and monogastrics, but I think that's a really important distinction to make and to understand if we're getting into animals and thinking about how they're going to work within our farm systems. And then finally, what we're talking about at the end of the day is maintaining habitat for these animals and leveraging their skills in landscape, thinking about ways that they're contributing positively. And I think we can all agree that this kind of landscape and this kind of animal management is not something that we're striving for. I think we understand, and if you don't, you can dig deeper into the problems with the way that most animals in the United States are raised. Pretty much 98% of beef and lamb and grazing animals are raised in confinement operations. This is where they're kept in one space for a prolonged amount of time, and they're finished most often on a food that they're not actually adapted to eat. So most often grains or grain residues. So there's a lot of problems with the system, and this is really not what we're after when we think about this kind of ecological approach, when we think about animals in habitat. This is certainly not where they would prefer to be. They can tolerate it to some degree, but there's also a lot of problems that arise from this type of system. When I look at our farm and when I look at farms that are doing ecological management, what I think about is, are these animals experiencing something that's not just about meeting their food needs, but also a greater sense of fulfillment, in a sense, of their life and what they experience on the landscape. And it doesn't mean that we don't grapple with the fact that we slaughter and cull and shift how animals interact with our landscape. And that's a challenge of any livestock farmer, to grapple with that notion of taking that life and making those decisions. But we think about them as, while they're on the farm, having as great an experience as possible. And it's not just about animal welfare, but it's actually about how productive and healthy they can be at the same time. So for us, when we think about habitat for animals, one of the things that we really focused on is the idea of silvopasture, because silvopasture really encourages us to combine good practices in animal care, good rotational grazing practices, and then we add in trees. And when we add in trees, what we do is we diversify the landscape. We create habitat for not just the animals we're working with, but also for wildlife in general. And we also buffer against some of the major effects that we're seeing from climate change. And so silvopasture really offers kind of to me, the holy grail, or sort of the high bar when we think about providing animal habitat for grazing animals. Silvopasture can be it can come from 2 directions. It could be taking existing woody dominated landscapes, forests, or overgrown sort of brushlands, and thinning those out, essentially creating more light, comes into the forest and is able to produce pasture. You can also put trees into pasture, and that's mostly what we've been doing on our farm, is working with planting trees and thinking about ways that can integrate with our grazing system. And I think one of the most big benefits that we found is that the trees in the landscape, what they do for the animals is they provide shade, and they provide shelter from both the heat of the sun, the winds that can be really affecting their health and well-being, from snow and the effects of storms in the winter. And they also really provide a high quality drought-resistant fodder. So we've been doing a lot of work on our farm, understanding the value nutritionally of trees like black locust here, which is nutritionally pretty much equivalent to alfalfa, so really high protein forage. And other trees like willow, which provide things like condensed tannins, which will reduce the methane that a grazing animal is giving off into the atmosphere. And condensed tannins will also balance out the rumen and actually prevent the outbreak of parasite populations in the environment. And so you have kind of these converging forces. You have all these possibilities when we think about planting trees, because we're starting to diversify the landscape and create this kind of habitat. This is more like what these animals would have experienced back if they were in sort of a wild state. So I think what's really important, and I mentioned fundamentally, if we're going to work with livestock, we have to think about moving them. Our infrastructure, our patterns, and our work has to be based in rotational grazing. And the question I have for you all to consider is, when does something actually count as rotational grazing? Does it count if I move them once a year? Does it count if I move them once every 6 months? Or does it count if I move them every day? And the answer somewhat depends, but really when we're talking especially about grazing ruminant animals that are mainly based in grass systems, what it really comes down to is we're talking about a system that is responsive to the way that grazing plants are adapted. So what happens when an animal eats a grass or a legume is that essentially 3 days after that first bite, that grass tries to regenerate itself. It tries to grow back and regrow. And so if our animals are in there more than 3 days in a given space, we don't keep them out of that space essentially, then we're creating an overgrazing situation. Now, if you leave them in there for 5 or 6 days, then maybe they clip that once and they're stressing the plant a bit. If you leave it in there for 9 or 12 days, it's even worse. And if you leave them in there for a month, it's of course even worse, because they're really stunting that regrowth. That's really essential. So while we're livestock managers, if we're working with animals, what we really are is we're also managing food. We're managing forage, especially when we talk about ruminant animals. And so it's really essential to understand the fundamentals. And if you're going to get into or continue to improve your livestock operation, you think about rotational grazing as a really key point to that. And I think a really good way to start, the way I understood rotational grazing from the beginning, was that we might start with the idea that we put animals into a space when the forage is about 10 to 12 inches tall. And when it's about 4 inches or maybe as low as 2 inches, we take them off that landscape. And you can see here, this is very early on in our farm. Most of this pasture was pretty low quality. It was mostly goldenrod. It wasn't stuff that they were getting a lot of energy from. It wasn't their preferred food. But the same principle worked. And over time, we've worked this pasture, and just through good rotational grazing practices, we've seen this really shift from something that's really low quality, something pretty high quality, without any extra inputs other than our labor to move this fencing around, which takes some time. But once you learn it, once you get a system down, it can be a pretty efficient way to go. And this landscape, I should mention too, is also littered with trees at this point. This is a photo from 2012. And so just 7 years later, we have trees throughout this landscape, which really adds additional benefit. So rotational grazing is a fundamental. And then I think what we have to do is step out of a bit of where we've gone with animal husbandry, where we've really reduced the animal to thinking about it as something that's not very intelligent, not very smart, something we can control and exert some kind of dominance over. I think that's really a problematic approach when we think about being good livestock managers. What I mean by that is animals have inherent wisdom. And if you don't believe me, look no further than the work of Fred Provenza and folks at Utah State University, who have based their work in ecological understanding. So they started really with observing wildlife and recognizing the behavior and the feeding patterns of wildlife. And then they started to realize that the same kind of understanding they had for the wild beings out there in the world was not something that was being translated to domestic livestock. And that was a real problem they saw. So they asked really detailed questions. One question, for instance, is, well, why do sheep prefer to eat clover in the morning and then they eat grass in the afternoon? Why do they choose one over the other? And why does that vary between individual sheep? And why does that vary on different days? It's not that sheep are going into a pasture and always going for clover, which is a high protein feed, and then maybe eating a little bit of grass. They actually continuously are balancing, and there's a lot of nuance in the way. And it's not actually within a flock, it's within the individual. And so this spawned a whole field of what we call behavior-based management. I'd really recommend you visit this website, behave.net, which has a lot of the summary of really over 40 years of research, really looking at how animals behave in the landscape and what lessons we can learn as we think about how we are good stewards of animals in the landscape. I'll just give you a little bit of a snapshot of those. And then after I do that, we'll pause and we'll see if there's any questions before we move on in the presentation here. So the first thing is they understood from their exploration of wildlife, then this translated to domesticated animals, that animals taste and smell and check out things in the landscape, and then they try them. Similar to us, maybe it was when we were children, we kind of tried a few things, we nibbled on a few, and we got feedback from that interaction. Some things we liked, some things we didn't. And on some level, you could say, well, I just don't like that, or I just don't like this, or I like that. But in actuality, our body's actually giving us a biochemical feedback response to certain foods. And it's all about balancing what's going on in ourselves. And Fred Provenza and company have done a tremendous number of experiments to really prove that this happens. It happens continuously. That if animals are given the chance to explore their environment, sample a diversity of foods, they will balance their diet again and again. They will avoid toxic plants in the environment, because if they're familiar with the environment, then they taste the compounds in plants that would be quote unquote toxic, and they're able to balance that. This is the opposite of animals who are kept in confinement and fed what is often known as the TMR, or the total mixed ration, which is a pre-formulated diet that doesn't give them any sort of option, any sort of choice. And that's really what's key in this, is choice. So these behaviors are happening all the time. The animals are learning, and they're not only learning from their interaction in the landscape, but they're actually learning from mom. So the research showed that the young would actually start to learn flavor preferences for different types of food, not only when they were born and starting to milk. Those flavors would translate into the milk that mom was feeding their young, but also in utero. So actually during the pregnancy, that those preferences would start to develop. And those are essential things. And that the idea is that the flavor preferences are not something that are just learned out on the pasture, but actually learned much earlier in that. And I think most interestingly from Fred Provenza's work, this idea of satiety, this idea of satiation, that animals actually need to explore, search out, check new things out, have novel experiences in the landscape, that we're not just after a volume of food that translates into meat or milk or fiber or whatever we're after, that actually their experience is really essential. And again, it's not only about animal welfare and sort of doing something ethically, it's actually about them being productive and healthy. And so Fred was able to show with his research a lot of benefits when you approach the scenario this way. So one kind of final anecdote, one of Fred's sort of side tangents in his research, he went to France, and with researchers there, they followed traditional French herders, shepherds in the landscape. And traditionally, the shepherds are viewed as sort of, peasants. They're ignorant people in the landscape that don't have a lot of sophistication. They just move the sheep around and they go here and they go there. But when they actually looked at it from a researcher standpoint, what they recognize is this is centuries old technology, where the wisdom and knowledge of the shepherd actually guides them to make different decisions about what those animals need at different times of the day and at different days and different weeks of the growing season. And they'd actually look out over the landscape and they would know it so intimately that they would understand that the sheep might actually benefit from going far afield, maybe to paddock 7 there in the morning, and then moving to paddock 11, and then at night maybe coming down to paddock 14. And they drew this analogy as they did this years of research, that these shepherds were actually more like chefs, crafting and creating a meal together. And that these chefs these meals had an appetizer, they had a main course, they had a dessert, and that was really important, the order that different foods were coming in. So sometimes you'd have really high foods and condensed tannins, and then you might have a high protein dish, and you might have something that's more soft and supple, like some grasses to eat. And then maybe something was heavier in flowers, because flowering plants in the landscape provide a lot of minerals and nutrients. And so incredibly fascinating and important to understand. And we're not going to necessarily be herders herding our animals over hundreds of acres, but there's a lot of implication to the things that they learned. And they summarize this in a number of papers, as well as in this wonderful book, The Art and Science of Shepherding. And then very recently, Fred Provenza released this book called Nourishment, which really talks in more detail about some of the nuances. And there's a couple excerpts from Nourishment in our Small Farm Quarterly, which is a publication you can find on the Small Farm website. So I'm going to pause for a minute. I'm going to put this chart up just so people, if you're just kind of thinking about things, you can start to look at this. We're going to talk about some scenarios, some examples of farms that are working with livestock in innovative ways. But I also want to pause and see if there's any questions that we want to address about anything I've covered so far.
Sure, sure. There were a few that came in, and for those out there that are viewing this, feel free to type in your questions. You can use the chat feature, or rather the question feature, or text me at 413-214-1227. But there was a question concerning the rotational grazing. You had mentioned that it's good to kind of paddock off or kind of cluster livestock when the feed is 10 to 12 inches tall. And I believe you said once it got to 2 inches tall, move them. What would be the result if you let the livestock graze below that or graze beyond the 2 inches?
Sure, great question. So the result is really you're starting to set back the energy reserves of the plant. And also especially with small ruminants, when we think about goats and sheep, what you're doing when you're getting really below 4 inches is you're potentially exposing them to a number of parasites that tend to congregate in those lower layers of grass. And so it's sort of twofold. It's exposing, and actually cattle will also be exposed, and pigs to a degree, to parasites as you get lower and lower. But essentially leaving that residue is organic matter that's able to help stimulate the regrowth of the grass. And if we go too far, it's really hard to say if we're maintaining good stands of forage or if we're really degrading them. So it's kind of a rule of thumb. It's tricky because no two paddocks on a farm are ever the same, and they grow at different rates, and we're constantly juggling and figuring out where the best place for our sheep to go next is. But that's the basic answer, is you're starting to get into the realm of doing some overgrazing damage.
And another question that came in from a viewer, you were speaking about flavor behaviors, if you will. If there should farmers or ranchers provide choices in terms of growing certain things if it's not available for particular ruminants, or say, sheep may like something over what a cow would eat and it's not available, should the farmer or rancher actually grow those choices?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think I'm sort of gleaning from Fred Provenza's summary, and again, I think he's got publications, he's got YouTube videos, got all sorts of information out there. But the thing I get from him is, we want to provide as diverse a landscape as possible, and that doesn't have to be within every single paddock, but definitely across the landscape, the animals have options that they can choose from. And I do think in many cases, and that's one of the reasons we plant trees in our farm landscape, is because we're providing a higher level of high protein forages or high condensed tannin forages, things like that, than is naturally found in the landscape. And so I think there is cause to, over time, add in and diversify pasture. But I don't want it to be a setback for folks to worry too much. It's not like we have to have one of everything throughout the landscape. I think what's important is to understand that diversity is really what's important, that we're not just feeding them all, a diet of timothy and clover as the only two options day after day, but we actually try to increase that diversity over time.
Okay, great. Well, no further questions at this time. We'll probably have some more as you continue.
Okay, great. So this chart is from the Silvopasture book that I authored. It came out last summer, and really the goal of that book was for us as farmers. My wife and I were both interested in silvopasture, but the resources out there were hard to find and hard to decipher. And so we really were trying to pull together the latest research, the latest understanding, and share that out with folks. And so one of the things we looked at is, when we think about how animals interact with the landscape, really coming from this perspective of the sort of functions that they perform. And I guess the opposite of that would be the damage they could do. So, scratch birds like chickens and turkeys, for instance, are really great at light tillage. They can actually help prepare soil for planting. They can help remove, vegetation that you may not want. But if you let them do that for too long, they can do damage, right? They can create issues. So that's kind of the two ends of, I think, animals. All these animals can do great work in the landscape. They can also do great harm, and it's up to us to again, select the right animal and also think about their role in the landscape and then move them on before it becomes a damaging effect. We use ducks a lot on our farm. One of the things we use them for is actually to trample and prepare and work on sort of the wetland work that we're doing. We have a wetland before the pond that we built in front of our house, and we put them in there last winter, and they tamped it all down, and they kind of made little waterways and pathways. They know what to do in that landscape. They do it better than we could ever do with machinery or by hand. And yet, if we'd left them in there a week or 2 weeks too long, they would have started to do damage. There would have been too much manure in the landscape. There would have been too much erosion as a result of that. So timing is really key. And I think, my biggest advice for new livestock people is you got to build in time to observe and understand and really appreciate what the animals are actually doing. If you just go out there to feed them, move them, and then you walk away every time, you got to sit down in a chair, sit down on the grass, see what they're doing, and understand their interaction with the landscape. So a couple examples here. I think that we have sort of our webbed feet friends. We have our ducks, and with our flock of ducks, we actually keep a couple male geese. You can see here. We read early on, and we're sort of skeptical but curious. If you raise a couple male geese with the flock of ducks, they actually will imprint on the flock and become a guardian for them. And we had to go through a few geese, before that really worked out, but it worked out. So we have two. These are African geese is the breed, with our flock of about 30 to 50 ducks, depending on the season. And what we find best with the ducks and the geese is they can really do a lot of good work in orchards. They will do a lot of pest control. They'll do a lot of fertilizing of phosphorus. They'll trample vegetation. They'll trample grass, and they often won't disturb even pretty tender vegetables. Now, I wouldn't put them in with my most tender salad greens, but something that's a little bit less intense than that, then they do really well. We've had them in our garden for many years. And again, it's all about the timing. If you leave them in there a little too long, they might start to do some damage, but they do really well, and they're really our pest control agent on the farm. And we could compare and contrast that to a farm up the road from us, the Good Life Farm, which has a larger orchard, more commercial orchard. Our orchard's a little more hobby scale. It's not one of our main farm crops, but the Good Life Farm is a cider making farm, and they have mainly apple and peach trees, and they use turkeys and also geese as a pest control mechanism, and they're moving them pretty frequently so that they avoid kind of bare ground, but these are scratch birds. And specifically, they're looking for what happens with scratch birds. So we think about turkeys, we think about chickens, we think about guinea fowl, is they're very precise, and they're very good at sort of, light tillage on the ground and kind of looking for insects and digging out some specific things. Not so much, the sort of broad scope that the ducks or the web-footed poultry might provide. This is a system where in between the rows of apple trees, there's asparagus patches, and those asparagus patches are incredibly laden with a bunch of pests, and they figured out that if they get the turkeys in after the asparagus harvest, they could actually reduce their pest pressure as they went through. Back to our ducks, we've used our ducks for many years with our mushroom production, which is in the woods, basically using them to reduce the impact of slugs on the landscape and try to reduce that impact on the landscape. And we're basically turning slugs into eggs in this process, right? They love doing this. This is a task. This is the least favorite thing I have to do on the farm, which is to pick slugs off of our fruit bushes, of our berries, off our mushrooms. And it turns out that the ducks actually love to do that. So we find that interaction, that mix, and we do quite well together. So that's poultry, and the big thing with poultry and pigs, I want to emphasize, is that one of the things they require is there's really no examples that we find on landscape where these animals are getting 100% of their diet from the landscape. There's pretty much in every case an off-site grain input that comes into the system and becomes a factor. And so I think that's really important to understand and be intentional about if that's the case, right? So you're going to have outside grain. And with pig farmers, often folks are recapturing waste grain resources, that sort of thing as they go. But in general, we're dealing with a situation where there's outside inputs, and we'll contrast that with the ruminants. So we call poultry and pigs sort of monogastrics as we go. Probably the oldest system of silvopasture of grazing that's been sustainable for over 400 years is the Dehesa and the Montado in Portugal and in Spain. And these systems do utilize pigs, but I think what's often lost in the idea of sustainably moving pigs through is these pigs, these are the Iberian black pigs that are very famous for high quality pork. They're actually only grazing through these systems when these trees are producing acorns, high quality protein sources that the pigs are rotated through on a very short term basis. They're not in there continuously. Most of the season, this dehesa is actually maintained. This is again in Spain and Portugal with sheep, but the pigs only come in during those really specific times. And if those trees haven't produced a lot of high protein feed, then they don't go in because they can do a lot of damage. So pigs and poultry present an opportunity and also a challenge because they can be utilized to do pest control. They can do some light tillage. They can clean up the drops after a harvest of some kind of fruit or nuts, but they have to be really carefully timed, and they may not be able to continuously come back to that same piece of land over and over again without doing some damage. I think an example of someone who's really thinking creatively about pigs, Cliff Davis, a farm called Pig and Leaf, which is down in Tennessee, is using pigs to both clear land. He's doing them on a rotation. He's following them with cover crops and with tree planting. And he's got some of the best examples that I came across in terms of sustainable pig management. And I think the biggest thing is you got to move them really, really quickly. You can't keep them in one space for too long or else they'll do quite a bit of damage. So we can contrast that with the ruminants. So ruminants are animals. We have our goats, we have our sheep, we have our cattle, and our cows. And all those animals, what's the magical secret that they have is they can take anything green in the landscape, essentially, and they can digest it. And essentially what they have is a stomach that is a fermentation vessel. And so the advantage of them over the monogastrics, the pigs and the poultry, is that you can get 100% or more of their food from the landscape. That potential is there. And every year you can increase the quantity and the quality of food that they might have access to. You can also potentially use these animals in scenarios where you're trying to remove or get rid of vegetation because it's not browse adaptive, meaning that over time as it gets browsed again and again and again, it actually will remove itself from the landscape. And so I think that ruminants have an incredibly important role to play. I think they can be an incredibly sustainable source of food. When we get to the monogastrics, we have to think really carefully about where those protein sources, where those food sources are coming from, and they're often off farm. Not in every case, but often. But ruminants, again, we can kind of rebuild and regain this landscape sort of wealth. And we've experienced this a lot with our sheep. We have Katahdin sheep, which kind of look like a goat-sheep hybrid. They're a hair sheep because they're crossed. They're a Dorset, sort of a couple sort of UK breeds crossed with a St. Croix, which is a Caribbean breed. And so they actually just shed their hair. They don't actually get sheared. And they kind of have a nice balance of like cold and hot tolerance, and they're quite favorable of browse, which browse, we usually use that term to say anything that's kind of woody versus forage, which might be on the grassy type landscape. And so they pretty much equally prefer the two. And we've really set them to work to sort of shift our landscape succession over time. And so we use our animals as a tool to shift those areas of the farm which were, I should say, overgrown and impenetrable and unmanageable from our perspective. We've opened them up. We've started to get more grasses, more clovers, more legumes to show up, and we're able to manage that system. Honestly, in 2016, we had a historic drought on our farm, and this is a picture from that year where these animals were subsisting off of this brush. Because what's interesting in a drought year is that the grasses and the legumes in the pasture don't grow, but the woody stuff looks pretty good. And so we actually were able to really stretch out our food rations. We didn't have to buy any supplemental feed in that year because we were able to feed this type of material to them. And there's often fear of a lot of toxicity issues when you start to just kind of unleash animals in these landscapes. But again, what we found, and based on Fred Provenza's work, if they're familiar with the landscape, if they've been given access, this is the type of life they live, they tend to be able to self-regulate. They've eaten many plants that are on lists that say they're quote unquote toxic, but they've been able to balance their diet and even eat some of those. And there's a debate going on in the livestock world right now about, what does toxicity mean versus something that might be actually beneficial in small doses. And if the animals can self-regulate and understand that, they can actually gain some benefit from some of those potentially quote-unquote toxic plants. And it's really key to understand that that comes from an animal who's used to doing this in the landscape, not from an animal who's used to being in confinement. So if you have animals that came from that, or that's the way you've been raising them and you want to introduce them in the landscape in this other way, you have to do it very carefully and with a lot of consideration. Here's a picture. This is actually a US Navy base down in the southeast US, where they're using goats specifically to remove some non-desirable vegetation. What's really key to understand with if you're trying to use animals specifically to remove something that you don't want in the landscape is that you sometimes have to create a scenario where that's the only thing they have an option to eat. So they might find all the preferential browse before that or forage, and then they go for the thing that you actually want them to eat. And that can be really tricky from a management standpoint. And it's kind of different than if you're just trying to raise goats for meat or milk. Because you might be trying to get as much good high quality forage in them versus use them for this kind of removal of something. And so often in these scenarios, you'll have them graze on something that you want them to eat, and then you might move them to another area where they have something more substantial, something more nutritious over time. Here's an example of Icelandic sheep. This is in Minnesota being used at a nut tree farm. And often sheep traditionally have been used in nut and fruit orchards to clear the land and mow. And we have several examples of farms that use the animals to basically reduce or eliminate the demand for mowing in their orchard systems. Back to poultry, I have a friend up the road from me who has an apple orchard, and he uses geese exclusively to essentially eliminate or reduce his mowing. He uses about 20 geese to the acre, and he says that pretty much keeps the grass at check because the geese will actually graze grass. He does have to supplement with some feed, of course, but in terms of what your goals are, and I think that's a very different approach. Our farm is raising livestock for the livestock itself and for the ecological benefits. But if I'm a fruit or nut farmer and my main goal is to have animals to do that kind of work in the ecosystem, that pest control work, that vegetation control work, that's a very different goal. I might need less animals. I might manage them differently. I'm not as worried maybe about their size. I want to make sure they're healthy, of course. But so there's very different goals, and if you try to combine all of them, sometimes that can be really great. Sometimes that can be quite challenging at the same time. So, different examples here. I think that sheep and goats, generally speaking, when we look at the spectrum of ruminants, we see that cows kind of like the grassy stuff first, and they might eat a little bit of woody vegetation. Goats, on the other hand, are kind of the other end of the spectrum. They really prefer woody browse. They like this kind of stuff, and then they'll, add a little bit of grass in, but not that much. So if you have an open pasture, goats may not do the work that you want them to do, and then sheep are kind of in between, and it really depends within the sheep breeds of where that kind of lies. And so we have, sheep that are grazing on just grass alone, sometimes a mix, and sometimes actually prefer woody stuff almost as much as pasture. And that's, for us, why we found that the breed that we chose and the way we've taken care of them has really lended itself well to our landscape, because they're able to utilize the widest range of vegetation that's available. Final picture here. This is from my friend Brett Chedzoy's farm, Angus Glen Farm, which is just to the west of us. And Brett's farm is a really stellar example. It's a close to 500 acres of grazing. He does Black Angus cattle. Although I want to say that these aren't your kind of common Black Angus. They're almost like heritage Black Angus. So again, he chose a breed, and the reason he chose Black Angus is because it's a really common, familiar, and highly desirable type of beef. And on top of that, the animals are widely available, but he really focused on, within that breed, finding really good lineage, really good lines to breed. And I'd almost call these like a heritage style Angus, where they're not the Angus that are used to sort of feedlot life. They're really a grazing Angus, and they will eat actually quite a bit of woody stuff as just part of what they're used to eating in the landscape. But the picture here is part of his farm. It's about, I believe it's about 10 acres, where he's a forester by trade, and he planted a black locust, black walnut plantation. Mostly what's there now is the black locust. He's been one of the wonderful things about black locust, I mentioned already, that's a really good fodder for animals. Black locust posts are incredibly rot resistant. The old farmer saying is that if you put a black locust post in the ground, the way to know when it's time to replace it is you put a rock on top of it, and when the rock decomposes, it's time to replace the post, right? So incredibly rot resistant. Every time I've put a locust post in the ground, I'm assuming it's probably going to outlast my time on Earth. And so these are fast growing trees. They're incredibly rot resistant. And he's been thinning out this grove, grazing underneath it. The grove provides really nice shade for the animals in the hottest part of the summer. And of course, with that nice black Angus coat, you're gonna get hot when it's hot out. He's harvesting these posts. He used them to fence his land, and then once he had fenced his land, he used them as a cash crop. Something like $1,000 to $1,500 an acre he's getting in fence posts as he thins these out, right? So what we see here is a system that is supportive of the animal, is creating habitat, is providing multiple yields, multiple income streams for the farmer, is actually reducing his costs because, again, initially he harvested the black locust and used that to fence his farm. And this is where you get what we would call in ecology a win-win-win-win-win scenario, right? The ecology of this landscape is incredibly diverse. It's good for wildlife, it's good for birds, it's good for insects, it's good for the grazing animals in terms of their comfort, it's good for them in terms of their nutrition, and it provides really a good income stream for the farmer, something that's very resilient. These are the spaces that during extended periods of drought are going to produce really good forage. They're going to be able to withstand better extreme rain events like we've been having a lot in the Northeast. And so, for a lot of us, this is why silvopasture becomes such a compelling concept in the landscape. So I'll end it there. There's a lot more, of course, in all these directions, but I hope that's a nice summary and overview of some of the considerations. My 2 books are down here on the bottom. The Farming the Woods book really focuses on a wider range of possibilities of what you can do in the wooded landscape versus silvopasture, which really looks at the interaction of animals in the landscape. You can find our farm website. You can check out the book, and we have a number of classes coming up if you're interested. We do a fungi course every September. We have a course about working with water in the landscape. We do a lot of pond building and swale building and ditch building, really trying to work with the fact that we just keep getting more and more water and heavier rain events. In November, we have a hedge laying class. And if you haven't looked up hedge laying, it's a really fascinating technique from the UK and from Europe, which is really looking at basically building living fences for livestock out of brush and debris, which is really cool. And then every winter, we do a silvopasture online course. We haven't figured out the dates yet for that. If you're interested, one of the best ways, and one of the best ways to stay in touch if you're interested, is to visit our farm website, wellspringforestfarm.com, and just sign up for the email list. And we really don't bombard you with a lot of emails. We just send it out once in a while. We just keep you posted on what's going on our end of the woods. So yeah, with that, I thank you for your attention, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there's any to field out there.
Sure. Well, thank you, number one, Steve, for such a in-depth webinar and going into how silvopasture and really how animals can be of benefit to us in agriculture in a very natural way. So I really am appreciative of your time with us tonight. I did have one question that came in concerning what happens during the dry months. Joe, one of our viewers, mentioned that he had grass that's not close to 10 inches yet. And that's after a 45-day rest period. Can you speak to times of very, or the dry period when grass is not coming back as quickly?
Yeah, so we sometimes call that the summer slump, which is that time of year when things don't, in the spring and the fall, and we're talking about the Northeast, right? We're talking about the temperate climate where we tend to have really explosive growth in the spring, really slow growth in the summer, and often kind of somewhere in between in the fall. That 10 inches, 12 inches is, I'd say it's an ideal. We're grazing some pasture right now that's not quite there, frankly. It's something to strive for and understand and I think one resource I'd really recommend for folks is The Art and Science of Grazing, which is by Sarah Flack, which sounds like she was on your program before. And she really breaks down And what we say is, here's the ideal and here's the reality. And so we kind of have to work within that reality. But it's important for us to understand when we may not be grazing under optimal conditions, or when we might be starting to stress our systems a little bit. And if persistently, I'd say year after year, you're hitting that time of year when things are dry and you don't have a lot of pasture at that height, we probably need to think about extending the rest period longer than the 45-day rule or the 30-day rule or the 60-day rule, which are all different rules. And nowhere is this more evident. Some of the grazers I've learned from in the West, where in the spring you might be grazing every 30, 45 days, but in the summer, late in the year, you might have to wait over 100 days for that to recover, right? Because the sort of drought is even more intense there. So what that's telling me is, well, over time we need to think about a longer recovery period. It doesn't mean that, again, day to day, I'm a farmer, we're practical, and we have to do what we need to do, but recognize that as a symptom of something that maybe needs to be addressed in the long term. So less animals, more land, or improving the quality of pasture. One of the things that affects recovery that we know in pasture systems is the quality of the soil, what nutrients are available, if the pH is balanced. So a short-term strategy might be to test the soil and see if there's any major deficiencies, and that could be a strategy, because there's parts on our farm that grow back super quick, and there's parts that grow really slow, and so that's an invitation, I think, for us to investigate and figure out what's going on there and strive for that ideal of 10 to 12 inches before we graze it.
And on that note, looking at the environment, can you speak a little bit, a question came in concerning how this type of grazing and livestock care can affect or bring some relief to our current climate condition?
Well, I guess there's a couple ways. I think on one level, we're thinking about the larger climate picture, which is that we have too much carbon in the atmosphere, and we need to be pulling that carbon back into soil and back into living vegetation. So good grazing practices alone, without trees, can do a good amount to put carbon back into the soil. If we add trees, though, it really becomes exponentially better. And so that's been one of our main motivations for planting trees is, as much as we can justify doing that work on the farm, we just know we're doing good things for the climate. And that, I think, is on the kind of bigger picture scale. But, then there's the sort of day-to-day scale and the farm scale, which is that at least what we've been experiencing here in central New York is we're getting more rain overall, but when it comes, it's in very heavy rain events. We really haven't had an event. We had like 1 week this year where we had a nice slow, full day rain, which is what I remember as a kid growing up. We had a lot of days where it just kind of drizzled all day. We don't have those so much anymore. We get these really heavy, intense rain events, and then what we tend to see is dry periods for hopefully not very long, but it's often we get a rain event once a week now, and then maybe we only get one once every 2 weeks, and then in the worst years we might only get one once a month or once every 2 months. So we really don't know what that looks like. And I think on a farm level, good grazing practices, increasing organic matter in the soil, trees, these are all ways that we can buffer against those extremes. What we see is that in the most extreme climates, when we have trees and woody vegetation especially, they tend to look pretty good, whether it's the wettest year on record or the driest year on record. And quite, frankly, in my experience, that's been our main motivation for putting more trees in the landscape, is because they're just such a good buffer against those things. So it was really hit us home, as I mentioned, in 2016 when we didn't have anything to feed other than woody vegetation, and that's really what strung us along. And my hope is that the next time we get a large drought, we're actually in even better shape, and we're definitely on track for that. So I think that managed grazing alone, what's been found through research is that if you actually are doing rotational grazing, you can double the amount of forage coming off of a given acre of land because you're rotating and resting it. I think that's a good first step. And then I think the second step is, start thinking about trees and adding that kind of diversity.
Okay, all right. Well, thank you so much once again, Steve. And as you all can see, he has up the next workshops and events that are taking place. in the area. If you're in the area, please stop by. And Steve, if anyone wants to attend these events that you have on this last slide, should they contact you directly,
Yeah,
email you?
yeah.
Okay.
Through wellspringforestfarm.com, you can find the email and ways to find out more information and how to get in touch. Yeah.
Okay, very good. And his two books are also listed. You can go to Chelsea Green Publishers to order those books. And based on this information that we've heard tonight, if you haven't gotten the book, I would suggest to go ahead and get your copy. Also, to let you know, NOFA Mass, we will be having in our workshops, we have one coming up and talking a lot about farming and really utilizing nature's ability to actually be a help to farmers. We have a workshop called Farming for Maximum Photosynthesis. That will be September 1st at Many Hands Organic Farm in Barre, Massachusetts. If you're in the area, it starts at 10 a.m., goes until 2. If you have not been to that farm, I've had that chance to go to that farm a couple of times. It is beautiful, and it's very wonderful to see how they've integrated cover crops, rotation of crops, rotation of chickens and turkeys to really get the maximum out of that farm. Again, it is September 1st, 10 a.m. to 2 p.m. at Many Hands Organic Farm. You can go to nofamass.org to register. Registration is still open. And if you would like to, if you have need of a scholarship, we have scholarships available. So please go to our website as soon as you can. The first is upon us. And you can also see our other workshops that are coming up. Also, lastly, our winter conference will be in January 2020, and you'll see information coming up soon for that. And don't forget to check out our podcast series. Once again, I'd like to thank Steve for his time with us tonight. I know there's a fundraiser taking place in his area, so I'm going to close out as soon as I can so he can get back to that. But if you have any questions, this broadcast will be loaded onto our YouTube page by the end of the week. And if you would like a link, just let me know. You can email me at anna@nofamass.org. And tune in next month. We will be talking with Petra from Fruition Seeds. We're getting into that time where seed saving might be of use to those of us who garden and want to keep our particular favorite crops. I'd like to thank everyone for joining us once again, for taking time out of your busy schedules. Enjoy the holiday. Be safe. Happy growing. And I'll see you and hear from you next month. Have a great night. Peace. And thank you again, Steve.